and the Harvard Kennedy School.
Thank you. First off, my thanks to Kwan and his colleagues for organizing this. It's great to be here at a very timely moment when a lot of the events, as Professor Lee was mentioning, literally unfolding right now. I'm running on a lot of adrenaline right now. I dropped off my son this morning and was in a hurry, and he asked me why I was in a hurry, and I told him I was finalizing preparations for this conference. And so my 2-year-old son looked at me, clapped his hands, and he said, "Let's do this." And so with that 2-year-old enthusiasm and adrenaline, I present my remarks here. Looking at the U.S.-China cooperation in dealing with North Korea, I wanted to focus on 3 things. The first is stability. You're going to hear that time and time again, but what it means and the nuances related to stability. The second thing is a shadow. We're living in the shadow of what I would frame as the South Korean Northern policy. This is a very unique diplomatic achievement of South Korea in the early 1990s. And the implications of that are largely unexamined, but I think have a direct causal link to what's happening right now. And the third thing are signposts. If there are going to be changes in the way that China is dealing with North Korea under this new leadership, potentially, I don't think they're going to happen on the scale that a lot of analysts look at right now. But if they are to happen, what are some objective signposts that we can analyze altogether? So to first start off with stability, the decision point before the Chinese leadership right now is stability of the regime of North Korea being continually greater than the DPRK threat to regional stability. If the Chinese calculus shifts and the current cycle of escalation is deemed to be a DPRK threat that is growing more and more out of control and endangering regional stability, could this be the catalyst for not a fundamental shift of China's North Korea policy, but a recalibration? And certainly this is what Secretary Kerry is trying to gauge right now. He's testing this hypothesis. The second is looking at the shadow here, what I mentioned, to put a little more context in this very pivotal decision point right now. Again, to summarize that, is the stability of the North Korean regime greater than, the importance of the stability of the North Korean regime greater than the DPRK threat posed to regional stability? Now the context here, what I'm referring to in terms of the shadow of South Korea's northern policy, this is a reference to what the government of No Tae-woo carried through, something that his predecessor, Chon Do-won, and his team started to formulate. And the idea was to rebalance the power dynamic on the Korean Peninsula. As South Korea was emerging as an Asian tiger, there came with it new capabilities. And one was to engage China and the Soviet Union at that time in an effort to recalibrate China and the Soviet Union's relationship with North Korea. To summarize, as relevant to this particular point here, in return for a recalibrated relationship between China and North Korea, South Korea extended trade credits to China. And this was a very pivotal period because after Tiananmen in '89, China was a pariah on the international stage. North Korea continually had a very unique relationship with China, but in return for these benefits from South Korea, China basically stopped the preferential trading arrangement and key types of aid that was going to North Korea. On a very larger scale, the Soviet Union did something very similar. Gorbachev and his economic reforms and restructuring under perestroika were stalling. He was very desperate for loans, for help in getting the momentum going again. And so in return for about $2 billion of trade credits, the Soviet Union cut off the military type of relationship that it had with North Korea, more or less abrogated their mutual defense treaty, and set into motion what in many respects was, as we look very specifically at the China-North Korea relationship, what the North Koreans call the Great Betrayal. So what we see between the Communist Party of China and the Workers' Party of Korea is almost a lost decade of high-level relations between the party to party. You see the functionaries going back and forth, but this was a period where North Korea really felt that this was something of abandonment by the Communist Party of China. Coincidence or correlation, during this period in the early 1990s, North Korea rapidly accelerates its production of plutonium at its Yongbyon nuclear facility. We see also the devastation of a great famine and a great flood and natural disasters that preceded that. This was a very pivotal decade. So the question for many is coincidence correlation, specifically in the nuclear program. When North Korea starts to accelerate the production and the focus on this facility, how much this context had to do with it. Certainly there are other factors at play, but I would argue that this is something that is largely overlooked. And with this, the North Korean orientation to neighbors in the region are fundamentally different from this point going forward. One thing that I'd like to highlight is that for the Chinese government think tank analysts who look at the China-North Korea relationship, there is a notion that when China has to choose one Korea over the other, it usually contributes to a period of instability. I think if there's one key lesson and principle that the Chinese won't deviate from, it's this notion that they will not pick one Korea over the other. So continually the choice that is put before China is very that. Why not maintain and deepen your relationship with South Korea, a rising star? It's already a risen star. It's going to be even more prosperous. Why would you jeopardize that by latching on to North Korea, a sinking star? But I think this historical context, which for some may seem like ancient history, but something that is only yesterday for many in the Chinese think tank community, this is something that is quite pivotal in terms of trying to understand how large of a factor would have to take place in order for a major shift in China's North Korea policy. Let me move to the third part here, the signposts. If in fact we see the Chinese under this new leadership, the new senior leadership of the Communist Party of China, come to a view that this new leader in North Korea, Kim Jong-un, is outright reckless or incompetent, how could we gauge some of these signals and read some of these signals? I line up three, and they're under the heading of commercial or political economy. The first is shutting down or severely curtailing the operation of North Korean state trading companies in China. The reality right now is the Chinese effort to rebuild that party-to-party relationship has translated into North Korean state trading companies affiliated to the elites in North Korea, the 1%, operating more and more on the back of the Chinese national economy. The money that is generated from these firms do not go to the population of North Korea, to the general population. It specifically goes back to that 1%. So when you look at North Korean Chinese trade statistics, while on a country-to-country basis, bilateral trade of $6 billion may seem like a drop in the bucket compared to, say, China-South Korea trade, you have to remember that disproportionately that $6 billion is going to that 1% in Pyongyang. So if the Chinese leadership is serious, but not only sending a signal to Pyongyang and the new Kim Jong-un regime, but in fact trying to severely influence or drastically influence this new decision-making in Pyongyang, then curtailing the activities of these state trading companies, I think, would be one clear sign. A second signpost is the further development of the mineral resources, the mining sector in North Korea. Hamgyong-pukdo, near the eastern side of the border between China and North Korea, is a sector where the coal aspect of the development is already well established. The amount of trade that is increasing year on year of coal from these North Korean mines to the energy-starved provinces near North Korea have been documented to be quite significant. And this is something that now is entering into a period where the joint ventures between Chinese and North Korean entities are now starting to tap the rare earth element mines. There are some early reports that a titanium mine is coming online very soon. Why is that significant? The margins on rare earth elements are substantially larger than coal. But if you've built the infrastructure to mine the coal, and that's a proven capability of logistics and transportation, going after the rare earth elements and feeding that into the growing development of key provinces in China is pivotal. There's another element of this that is also overlooked in terms of why this is significant. It's not only for consumption or use in terms of Chinese internal economic development, but it's the opportunity of arbitrage that is presented to key provincial party officials. In the case of coal, provinces like Jilin actually have large deposits of coal themselves. Their coal tends to be of better quality than the North Korean coal. So what ends up happening is that the Jilin companies, and those companies tied to provincial party officials on the Jilin side, are mining their coal, exporting it to places like Guangdong, getting a higher price for it, importing the lower quality and cheaper coal, and it usually is cheaper because the Chinese partners underpay. And the difference, the margin can be quite substantial, and that's usually pocketed by provincial party entities on the Chinese side. So you can see how in the local periphery, there's a very powerful relationship of Chinese periphery having a lot in common with North Korean periphery and engaging in business. This isn't a good practice type of business. Both sides have documented cases of exploiting the other, but nonetheless, there's a recurring and deepening type of commercial interaction. This is also significant because periphery China, as I mentioned, has a lot in common with periphery North Korea, but in many instances, periphery China has very little in common in many respects on a day-to-day basis with the central authorities in Beijing. Usually it's the Beijing authorities that's a destination as certain party officials rise through the ranks. So the power dynamics on the Chinese party side, I think, is also something that is important to take into consideration, the relationship between provincial and center. Let me move to the third and final part with respect to the signposts. There are many more, but I think these are the three most significant. It's in the area of energy supplies from China to North Korea. It's no longer under the heading of strategic aid. The Chinese are not giving it to the North Koreans. It's usually a function of selling it to the North Koreans and usually charging a price that's higher than global spot prices, especially for oil. So it's a unique type of dependency type of relationship. But for the North Korean regime and the military, energy is much more important than food aid. So the connection to the oil and the different sources of energy supplies quite pivotal and something that can, if you're looking at ways to definitely put a dent in the operations and stability of the regime, it's not curtailing food aid, as some would believe, but rather the energy supplies. Let me conclude with some points about Xi Jinping. There is now a tremendous focus in Washington on Xi Jinping. There is the hope and expectation that he will be different from Hu Jintao as someone, as a princeling, as someone who's had exposure to, and this is, I think, maybe reading too much into it for many, but someone who's had exposure on a farm in Iowa, having traveled to the U.S. More and so forth, that somehow he's Western-oriented and maybe reform-minded, or some tendencies related to reform. It's still early days, so clearly we can see some aspects of this. But I think when you look at his particular background, there are a lot of family traits that are unique. One, his father being a military man very close to Peng Dehuai. So if you look at Xi Jinping, he grew up on a staple diet of hearing stories of the Chinese and the North Koreans repelling the Western imperialist advance, and that being a core sort of criterion for facilitating what eventually became the economic reforms in China. With that type of external stability, the view that these internal reforms really couldn't have taken place. One part that I thought was very poignant of Premier Wen Jiabao's, now former Premier Wen Jiabao's visit to North Korea with a very senior diverse delegation in October 2009 was his insistence that he be brought to the Martyr Cemetery. So this is where the graves of the Chinese volunteers, and Mao Zedong's son also buried there. And he gave a very emotional speech that was put on YouTube, and also went so far as putting a translation at the bottom. And there's one part where he's speaking to essentially the entrance to the cemetery, and he's basically saying, "Because of your sacrifice, brothers, we are living well in China." That's a very unique message. And shortly thereafter, Xi Jinping went to pay his respects at the embassy in the North Korean embassy in Beijing. It was one of the big party-to-party ceremonies. And he mentioned how the two parties, again, had repelled Western imperialism, and also insinuated that the Korean War was instigated by an attack from the U.S. and not the accepted and factual narrative of something triggered by Kim Il-sung. So the over-dependence of Xi Jinping as somehow being this reformer, I think we have to temper, because his background is very much of the party and the military. And one final thing I would mention is that with respect to the party that he leads right now, there's a very interesting symmetry in North Korea. The revival of the Workers' Party of Korea is significant because for the 17 years of rule of Kim Jong-il, Kim ran the country through the institution of the military, and specifically the National Defense Commission, the NDC. And the party during that 17-year period was basically allowed to atrophy. Now we're seeing a resurgence, but something that was really the planning and almost the last will and testament of Kim Jong-il. After Kim Jong-il recovers from his stroke, one of the things that he does is accelerate interactions and planning with the Communist Party of China. He goes and initiates 3 very important visits from May 2010 to May 2011. And through these types of meetings on the Chinese side, he meets with the current and at that time the future leadership of the Communist Party of China, senior provincial party officials from specifically the Jilin side, and many members related to party structures, but also Ministry of Commerce, National Development and Reform Commission, the very architects of Chinese internal economic development. And more or less, that set the foundation for the revival and the resurgence of the Workers' Party of Korea. So in many respects, if you look at the titles that Kim Jong-un holds, some are ceremonial in terms of, not ceremonial, the father maintains ceremonial, the general secretary of the party will be an eternal title that is affiliated to Kim Jong-il, as the president of North Korea is affiliated to Kim Il-sung. But with respect to Kim Jong-un, in practice, he holds all of the leading positions on the party, and through the party, the military, the Central Military Commission, as his counterpart in China, Xi Jinping. So that party-to-party interaction is important because for the purpose of rebuilding the relationship and stabilizing North Korea, the Communist Party of China interaction with the Workers' Party of Korea has been the institutional mechanism. So it's through that lens I encourage you to observe the signposts, and in the coming weeks and coming months to really assess if there is a significant change. Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks. At this point, we're going to open the panel up to questions from the audience. When you ask a question, please briefly introduce yourself first. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Michael Marks. I'm a junior here at Tufts. I'd like to thank the panelists for their excellent remarks. I'd like to tailor this question specifically to Dr. Park and Professor Lee. I think, Dr. Park, in your remarks, you were talking about specific ways in which China could leverage its economic investments in North Korea to kind of temper any greater belligerency on the North Korean part. But I was wondering, since North Korea, since stability in the Korean Peninsula is so key for Chinese security interests, to what extent can China use its economic leverage without hurting North Korea in a way that would damage its stability, therefore having a negative impact on China's security interest? Where's the kind of the balance there? I'd like to get both of your input on that. Thank you. Thanks so much.
The way that the North Korean state trading companies are configured, I think one way to think of it is North Korea Incorporated. So these are North Korean state trading companies specifically affiliated to the members of the elites, and usually through the institution, the military, the party. My view is the Chinese are aware of which state trading companies that are now based and operating in China are affiliated to which member. And so your question about how they could signal without jeopardizing the stability of the regime. My guess is that the Chinese authorities know the connections to the extent they can calibrate the messages. And so state trading companies affiliated to Chang Sung-taek, and that's Kim Jong-un's uncle, or things related to what's called Bureau 39, which is Kim Family Slush Fund. Those are things that I think can be calibrated where they are very direct. They're surgical. If you think of it as military kinetic uses of weapons, this is a precision-guided type of policy instrument. The Chinese have the rare access to this because there is a tremendous amount of traffic between Pyongyang and Beijing. So the North Korean elites, they go back and forth on a regular basis where just through the very customs officials, documents, and so forth, they would be able to triangulate on this information. No other country has this amount of information.
Me too. In the media, we often see the following expression: China could pull the plug on North Korea. I think that's a bit exaggerated. You have images of a dying patient and literally pulling the plug on the medical equipment and inducing death. There's, some truth to it, but there are many steps that many levers that China could use to put real pressure on North Korea before we get to that final stage. So as Dr. Park mentioned, certainly China does have economic leverage, also financial leverage as well. If the United States pushes for the kind of targeted financial sanctions we've seen before, and Chinese entities, Chinese banks cut business deals with North Korea, or give the United States Treasury Department information on North Korean accounts, even a small sample, that would send a message to North Korea.
Great. I have one question myself. So far, we've talked mostly about high-level politics, nuclear policy. One major concern in dealing with North Korea right now is the human rights situation within North Korea. Are there opportunities or is there any interest for the United States and China to cooperate in improving the human rights condition within North Korea?
Not as far as I can see, but I think that's why the U.S. needs to give China that incentive or disincentive, incentive to stop cracking down on North Korean refugees in China. So how do you achieve that? How do you get China on board? Well, the House is, putting together a new bill that will go after North Korea's illicit activities. And one item that it may or may not include, it's in there right now, is also crimes against humanity. Any North Korean entities and third country entities even suspected of abetting, furthering North Korea's operation of vast gulags, prison camps, and so forth, will be sanctioned. That is in the bill right now. It remains to be seen whether it will remain. But that kind of open-ended warning may have an effect.
Let me just add that I don't see any particular cooperation either between China and the United States on this issue, but I think this is another part of a reminder that this is a broad policy issue, that it is not just nuclear weapons. We have a number of issues in regards to U.S., China, North Korea relations. And this issue in particular makes it difficult because if you push on human rights issues, then it's going to be perhaps difficult to address some others. And I'm not suggesting you set human rights issues on the side, but it makes it difficult because you have a several cross-cutting dimensions to a broader policy issue and challenge than is sometimes portrayed, I think, in the media.
One opportunity that I think is interesting is increasing objective information. There are already a lot of reports and documentation and evidence about these camps in North Korea. If there's a way to increasingly translate that into Chinese and kind of feeder routes to Weibo and the netizens and whatnot, I think that type of exposure would be very, very important, because one thing that we're learning more and more is that the netizens do exercise a type of influence that is internal and in some cases can be more effective than external. To give you one example, it's a smaller example, but after the third nuclear test, there was a lot of rumor circulating among the netizens that nuclear contamination from the test site was spewing into certain parts of the Chinese territory bordering North Korea. And that caused a reaction. And I think when you look at those type of leverages, it would be interesting to develop more targeted feeder opportunities so that these different netizens can pick up on something of their own volition, and that can go viral in its own way.
Hi, my name is Guptian from the Fletcher School. Thank you. I would like to thank the panelists for your speaking today. My question goes to John Park, and as you mentioned that the trade between China and North Korea has not been just a subsidy, but also more focused on private and getting profits from North Korea. Are you pushing that maybe the trade between China and North Korea is more private-based, and so that way it's more profit-driven? Or is it more of a trade that tries to bring stability in North Korean region? Does China see North Korea as stability on itself without Chinese help? And also, you said that the trade has been more focused on energy rather than food, but North Korea, from our news reports, there's always a famine. The 20% of the land in North Korea is arable. Doesn't seem like they can survive with their own resources. So if you could maybe just elaborate more on that.
With respect to your first question, Wen Jiabao's visit in October 2009 was significant because he signed 3 sets of agreements under very innocuous sounding titles: economic development, education, and tourism. Those were political agreements, and I think one thing that we're seeing now are the monetization of political agreements. It was a signal from the Communist Party of China to the highest levels, to provincial, local entities, be they private or state-owned enterprises. It is okay to do business with North Korean partners. But the key thing for us, in terms of the Western community, is that items and activities that are frankly banned, either by national authorities or under UN Security Council resolutions, are labeled under the Chinese system as economic development. And so this whole policy debate about China needs to implement sanctions, in many respects, we don't even get to that point because in a large number of these instances, it's first off labeled as economic development. If you read the UN Security Council resolutions, in addition to the lists of prescribed activities or targeted officials on the North Korean side, there's one statement that says member states of the United Nations are not prohibited from engaging in economic development and humanitarian activities with North Korea. So there's your loophole. The second part about energy and food, energy I think is important to all the different groups in North Korea, but mostly to the regime. But when it comes to the food trade, it's interesting because the black markets that are now springing up near the border with China, one of the key things is the trade in food products and medicine. And that's a function of proximity to supplies and sources on the Chinese side, increasing flows of peoples and goods in key areas where the trade is encouraged and entry points are frankly not well inspected. In areas where there is a focus on the Chinese side to inspect goods and whatnot, it's not for illicit material related to WMD programs or things of banned items on the UN Security Council list. It's narcotics. One of the dirty secrets is that the narcotics trade is flourishing in that area, and it's frankly out of the control of the ability of local Chinese authorities. So there's an effort to inspect and try to interdict. If you look at the holding facilities in the border area, in addition to the unfortunate North Korean workers or refugees who are caught and they're in the process of being repatriated to fates unknown in North Korea, there are certain cells that are full of people related to the narcotics trade. And so that is an aspect that I think is also an indication that the porous nature of the border is doing quite well.
I think in every discussion of North Korea, some attention should be paid to the basic internal dynamic in the Korean Peninsula, whereby you have a two-state formulation, two Korean states competing against each other for pan-Korean legitimacy. And in that competition, we know who's clearly the winner. At least since the mid-1970s, South Korea has really raised the head of North Korea. It is the far more successful, richer, freer Korean state of choice for many North Koreans. The fact that you have increasingly, although over the past year, due to clampdown on border crossers, the number of North Korean defectors coming to the south has decreased quite a bit. The fact that you have this pattern of rising numbers of North Korean defectors coming to South Korea over the past several years since the famine in the mid-90s, this is a long-term existential threat to the Kim regime. So the fact that you have every year, thousands of North Koreans trying to escape their country, their repressive country, into China first, for many of them with the ultimate objective of resettling in South Korea. If you allow this, we don't know how many North Koreans will leave. And if all your people leave, then you don't have a state. You don't have a country. And that is an enormous, gloomy future, alternative future for the Kim regime. And the Chinese know it. Yes, they don't want to deal with floods of refugees. Yes, they don't want, the crime and social complexities that are bound to arise from low-income illegal North Koreans in Northeast Asia, in northeastern part of China. But the Chinese can deal with that. They say those things, but the real reason is stability, meaning status quo maintenance. They don't want to see North Korea go away.
I think as well, you have also seen over the last year or so North Korea as well trying to clamp down on border crossings as well because of exactly the same concerns that they see the threat to the regime of that sort of activity. I have also, though, seen reports that China does not necessarily fully enforce all of the sort of ability to grab North Koreans and send them back, that there is at least some recognition of perhaps some of the hardship and such. But again, as Professor Lee said, that is a huge threat for the North Korean regime to have that sort of activity happen on a larger scale.
We have time for one final question.
My name is Roman Madaus. I'm a third-year IR major undergraduate here, and my family is from Germany. And I see a lot of parallels between the issue of East Germany many years ago and North Korea today. And I know that the two ways that the United States sought to create pressure for reform in East Germany and also in other Soviet countries at the time was to generate external pressure and internal pressure. And obviously, external pressure, military force and sanctions did not work on East Germany and also has not worked on North Korea. And the other method is to generate internal pressure by utilizing the civilian population. And what actually was very effective in East Germany was the broadcast of television from West Germany and then also radio propaganda. It was popular music generally interspersed with propaganda. And I was wondering if you knew whether there are any similar efforts to do that, to beam telecommunications to be picked up by North Korean civilians from either bases offshore or in South Korea or from China, and then because of the North's, presumed negative reaction to such efforts, what China's position would be to that, and then also what we are doing, if anything, already in that direction.
Couple of comments. You see a South Korean group that tries to float balloons into North Korea from time to time with, I believe there's currency and leaflets and there's sorts of things in that, and the North Koreans leadership does not react very positively to that. There has been a lot of discussion about that very fact, that I think frustration in the U.S. policy community that something needs to be done to try to address the North Korean problem, if you will. And if you can't use force, perhaps, maybe more efforts have to be undertaken to try to address that sort of information flow and such, to try to generate the forces within North Korea to be able to create the unhappiness within the regime. That's not so easy to do. There is still a very heavy coercive arm within North Korea that addresses those issues. It's the ideological foundation is still fairly strong, although I think deteriorating somewhat. But it is a very interesting wild card, in my view, to think about, and I think in one of your earlier presentations, the issue of an Arab Spring came up in a different context, and some have asked, is that possibility likely in North Korea? And I don't think that's the case short term. But again, an intriguing possibility is that one of the dimensions of North Korea that has allowed it to be able to exist as it is its ability to control the information flow coming into the country. But I think increasingly you're seeing a slow leakage of that. And if you're interested, there's a fascinating report that was just released about a year ago in May called A Quiet Opening, which documents the amount of information coming in through DVDs, thumb drives that have South Korean movies, TV dramas, Chinese media sources, etc. And the interesting effect that has But again, if you're expecting an Arab Spring to happen in North Korea, don't expect it. That's not going to be happening for a while. But it is interesting to speculate if long-term that sort of information leakage, if you will, could perhaps have an effect.
I just add, the U.S. government runs Radio Free Asia and Voice of America Korean service, so there are regular broadcasts. But amazingly, there's a decision that they're going to stop one of the radio broadcasts, and it's not because of budget cuts. They did surveys with North Korean defectors and others in the border area, and they found that the podcasts, what they were streaming online, had greater penetration than radio. You know, while North Korea is a closed society, the information penetration is actually increasing. And when you look at the increasing use of cheap Chinese mobile phones in the border area, that's actually proliferating as well. The only limiting factor is distance from the Chinese-based cell towers. So if you draw a circle around those Chinese cell towers along the border and look at how they extend southward, that gives you extent to what populations on the South Korean side can communicate. But what's amazing is, as much as there's information increasingly about South Korea, various aspects of society, the political situation, other parts of the world, the North Koreans who have access to this type of technology are using it to trade information about prices of commodities. So if they're in one black market area, they call a relative or business associate and they find that the price of rice is lower or higher where they are, whatever supplies that individual have, they'll figure out a way to transport it. And here, North Korean military transport, they're dilapidated trucks, but they do the job. You hop in the back, you pay whatever fee, and now we have market movement, arbitrage, closing of arbitrage, profits. So information is being monetized. It's not being translated into mobilization and something that could be the early basis of a North Korean version of Arab Spring. The fundamental thing that's different about the North Korean regime compared to, say, Egypt or Tunisia, the North Korean regime has a monopoly on violence, and they will not tolerate something boiling to that level. So that's something that, as much as there's been different aspects of weakening and whatnot, the monopoly on violence is something that's very unique. It's not the military, it's the security forces. Security forces are better armed than the military in North Korea. One final point I would mention is East Germany was a nation state. It was a state. It had structures of government, military, and whatnot. North Korea has legacy structures, but in reality, it's a 1% of the population that runs not necessarily the country, but the regime structure, the elites. So when you look at the dynamics, I think the North Korean regime, one way to look at it is not as a nation state, but as an organism that has different types of hosts. That 1% organism now is embedding itself on the backs of the Chinese national economy. And so when it comes to trading things, procuring things, if you were to ask some of the key residents of Pyongyang, are you almost like a Gallup poll, do you live better today than you did 17 years ago? Every single one of them would say yes, and you can look at the material wealth they have. And that's because for them, doing business in not only in key parts of China, but in places like Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, it's only natural. But that's the 1%. The 99%, they are very closely tied to the black markets.
The South Korean government, in my view, should take the lead in this effort. It is the sole legitimate government in the Korean Peninsula, as South Korea claims, and is viewed as by most of the world out there, I would say. Unfortunately, information transmission efforts into North Korea in the South is grossly underfunded and undermanned. And the current president, as a candidate last year, on November 5th, when she made her foreign policy platform address, pledged to vastly reinforce such efforts. We have to realize that sending information into North Korea is not merely a matter of principle of the defense of the freedom of speech. It actually saves lives. We know that from defectors in the South, almost 50% of defectors who have made their way to South Korea say they have listened to, or they have seen, rather, they have watched some South Korean soap opera, TV shows, drama on DVDs, on thumb drives. over 30% of defectors say they have heard, foreign radio broadcasts. They've tuned in. And there is a direct correlation between exposure to the outside world and a stronger incentive to escape their repressive country. So the more and the sooner the downtrodden North Korean people are exposed to information about the outside world, the better the odds of saving North Korean lives.
Great. So this concludes the China the United States panel. Please join me in thanking our panelists here. Thank you.
Nice to meet you finally.
Nice to meet you too.
Find some
Paths
more,
cross
yeah,
again
a
sometime.
more leisurely time to chat. And